Part 1. The Floating Graveyard Paradox. Introduction. Imagine this for a moment. 65 men, packed shoulder to shoulder on a wooden vessel barely wider than a modern living room. Beneath them, the North Sea churns cold, grey, merciless. Above them, a sky the colour of iron. And between those two worlds, these men live their entire lives for weeks at a time. The air around them is thick, a choking mixture of salt spray, stale sweat, wet wool, and wood smoke. There is no privacy, no silence, no escape. They sleep between the very benches they row on, curled against shields, brushing against the same four bodies every single time they blink into sleep. And here comes the part that defies every law of medicine, every rule of biology, and every assumption we have about survival at sea. There were no toilets, no plumbing, not even a shared bucket for a crew of 60. By all logical standards, this ship should be a floating graveyard, because in the long, brutal history of the open ocean, disease, not storms, not battles, has killed more sailors than any enemy blade. Entire navies, armed with surgeons and sanitation systems, were wiped out by cholera, dysentery, and typhoid before they ever reached shore. And yet, these Norse sailors didn't just survive, they conquered. They crossed the Atlantic to reach North America 5 centuries before Columbus. They voyaged from the icy fjords of Greenland to the crowded markets of Baghdad. They raided, traded, explored, and returned home alive. So the question becomes unavoidable. How? How did these so-called barbarians manage the biological realities of human life without turning their longships into drifting petri dishes of death? Was it sheer Viking toughness, some legendary immunity we romanticize today? Or was there something far more ingenious, a hidden survival system woven into their architecture, their routines, and their culture? A system so clever, we can still learn from it today. Welcome to Historia Prime. Tonight, we dive into one of the strangest, smartest, and most overlooked survival stories in all of human history. This is the secret sanitation of the Viking Longship. Part 2. Designed to leak. The genius of architectural minimalism. To understand how the Vikings stayed healthy on the open ocean, we have to begin with the ship itself. Not the warriors, not the rituals, not the myths, just the wood, the iron, and the shape that carried them farther than any European people of their time. For over a century, archaeologists have dug into the Oseberg, the Gokstad, and the other great longships of the Viking world. They found carved dragons, iron-banded buckets, hand-forged nails, even ceremonial sleds and wagons. But among all those artifacts, one thing is never found. There is no toilet, no latrine, not a single space designated for waste, on a ship that carried more than 60 men across oceans. At first glance, this feels like a catastrophic oversight. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. The Viking longship was a masterpiece of intentional absence. Unlike the giant galleons of later centuries, Viking ships had no lower decks for men to rot in. There were no cramped cabins where sickness could bloom in the dark. Everything was open. Everything was exposed. The wind, the rain, and the sun, nature's most ancient disinfectants, swept across the deck every hour of every day. The very brutality of the environment became their shield. Respiratory infections that later tore through enclosed wooden hulls simply had nowhere to hide here. But if the open deck kept the air clean, what about the waste itself? This is where the brilliance of Viking architecture reveals itself. The longship was built using clinker construction, overlapping planks of oak riveted together in a way that created a flexible, breathing hull. To modern eyes, this design feels primitive because it leaks. Seawater slips in through the seams, trickling into the bilge. But to a Viking crew, this wasn't a flaw. It was the flushing system. The ship constantly inhaled and exhaled seawater. Every hour the crew scooped it out with wooden ladles, throwing it back into the waves. Any organic mess food scraps, spilled broth, or even accidental human waste was swirled into the incoming salt water and bailed out again before it ever had time to fester. There were no stagnant corners, no still pools. The ocean itself served as a cleansing cycle, renewing the bilge over and over, day after day. And when nature truly called, the solution was stunningly simple: immediate dispersal. The Longship rode so low in the water that the ocean was only half a meter away. At the bow, you simply leaned forward, let go, and the sea carried your problem into its endless dilution. Salt water and motion destroy pathogens faster than almost anything in nature. And that is why sailors, even centuries later, would still call the bathroom the head, because you went to the front, the head of the ship, where the wind and waves whisked your waste away before it could ever endanger the crew. The Vikings didn't store waste. They didn't manage it. They eliminated it instantly. They built a system where decay never had a chance to begin. And now the question turns to you, the modern viewer, living far from the raw logic of the North Atlantic. In your own life, what waste are you holding on to? What clutter, bad habits, or stagnant energy have you been carrying around, hoping for a better container, when the real solution might simply be to let it go? Sometimes the smartest system isn't a bigger storage space. Sometimes the smartest system is no storage at all. Part 3. The Reset Button. Strategic Seamanship. Even the most ingenious system has limits, and the Viking waste disposal method, brilliant as it was, could not withstand the pressure of a voyage that stretched for weeks. There comes a point where the sea cannot wash everything away, where bodies grow weary, clothes grow foul, and the air grows heavy. And this is where we discover the Vikings' most underrated survival advantage. Something hidden not in their tools, but in the very shape of their ships. The Longship rode so shallow in the water that it needed only about 1 meter of depth to sail. While other vessels across the Mediterranean required deep harbors and engineered ports, a Viking crew could bring their ship ashore almost anywhere, onto lonely coves, gravelly beaches, river mouths, or tidal flats. This wasn't a convenience, it was a lifeline. Historians believe the Vikings followed an unwritten rhythm along the European coastline, a series of natural reset points spaced roughly every 200 kilometers. These were not cities, not ports, just places where fresh water flowed, where the ground was firm enough for a campfire, and where the land could take on the burden that the ship no longer could. Every few days, the crew would beach the Longship, step down into ankle-deep water, and let their bodies breathe again. The ocean was no longer the filter, the land became the reset button. They spread out across the shore. They washed themselves in cold streams. They scrubbed clothes with sand. They cooked, they cleaned, they laughed, they rested. And in doing so, they prevented the biological pressure of a long voyage from ever reaching a crisis point. It was a simple strategy, but one that saved countless lives. By moving frequently, by refusing to stay confined, the Vikings sidestepped the fate of so many later sailors' men who spent months trapped in wooden prisons far from land, breathing the same stale air and drinking the same spoiled water until disease inevitably won. Yet even brilliance has a cost. Archaeological digs at major Viking centers like Hedeby and Birka reveal an unsettling truth. Intestinal parasites were far more common on land than on the ships. The very act of preserving crew health at sea meant concentrating waste, disease, and contamination at their winter camps and trading hubs. They stayed healthy while moving, but their settlements paid the price. Now imagine a place like Torksey in England during the winter. Not a handful of tents, but a vast temporary city spread across 55 hectares. Thousands of warriors, merchants, craftsmen, women and children. All confined for months because the ship could no longer move. The shallow draft magic. the freedom to reset, the ability to disperse, all of it vanished the moment the Longship was dragged ashore for the season. And in that stillness, something dangerous crept in. When you cannot move, how do you stop the sickness? This was the moment when Viking ingenuity faced its greatest test, and it's a question that echoes into our modern world more than we might admit. Part 4. The Dapper Danes. Culture as a defense shield. For generations, Hollywood has painted Vikings as wild, unwashed barbarians. Hair tangled, faces smeared with mud, bodies reeking of battle and sweat. But the real Vikings? They were cleaner, sharper, and far more disciplined than the myths allow. And in the struggle to stay healthy on an overcrowded longship, their culture became one of their greatest weapons. If you dig into Viking graves from Norway to Denmark, you'll find an object that appears more often than swords, more often than jewelry, and sometimes even more often than tools: the comb. This simple piece of bone, antler, or carved wood was not a vanity item. It was a survival device. The teeth were so fine that they could pull out lice, nits, and parasites, tiny creatures that in the medieval world were not just annoying, but lethal. Lice spread typhus. Fleas spread plague. A daily combing ritual wasn't about looking good. It was about staying alive. But grooming didn't end there. The Vikings had something almost no other medieval Europeans practiced with such discipline: a weekly bath day. The English chronicler John of Wallingford complained in the 1200s that the Danes were far too attractive to local women because they bathed every Saturday, kept their hair neat, and changed their clothes more frequently than Englishmen ever bothered to. The Viking word for Saturday still survives today: lørdag. Its Old Norse root, laugadaga, doesn't mean Saturn's day or the day of rest, but something far more revealing. It means washing day. Imagine the scene. Every morning on the Longship, men lined up around a shared water basin. They splashed their faces, rinsed their hands, wet their hair, and wiped their bodies with cloths dipped in the cold water. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveller who met the Vikings along the Volga, described the ritual with disgust because they all shared the same basin. But in reality, this routine placed them far ahead of many cultures around them. It meant their bodies were constantly cleaned, their hair was maintained, and parasites struggled to spread. What the Vikings created was not hygiene by convenience, it was hygiene by honor. Showing up unwashed or smelling rank was a mark of shame. Grooming was communal. It was expected. It was social discipline forged into daily habit. And when you cram 65 bodies onto an open deck for weeks at a time, discipline becomes a shield far stronger than steel. Their culture didn't merely keep them presentable, it kept them alive. And once again, a Viking truth echoes quietly into our modern world. Sometimes the most powerful survival system isn't technological, it isn't architectural, it isn't even physical. Sometimes it's cultural. Sometimes it's the standard you hold yourself to, even when no one is watching. Part 5. Accidental pasteurization. What was in the barrel? Even with flawless hygiene and a constantly flushed ship, there remained one enemy the Vikings could not comb out, wash off, or throw overboard. It was the invisible killer that haunted every sailor for thousands of years: the slow, silent rotting of fresh water. In the darkness of a wooden barrel, clean water turns deadly within weeks. Bacteria seep into the grain of the staves, E. coli multiplies, algae blooms. What begins as pure mountain spring water becomes a poison that can wipe out half a crew before they ever make landfall. Civilizations feared it. Navies were undone by it. And yet, Viking crews, sailing in some of the harshest waters on Earth, rarely succumbed to this ancient curse. The reason was simple and accidental. They didn't drink water. The Vikings understood something long before science could explain it. Fresh water spoils, but fermented drinks survive. So instead of filling their barrels with water, they filled them with weak ale, barely alcoholic, golden, cloudy, and with fermented milk products like whey or skyr. Not because they knew about microbes or germ theory or pH levels, but because these drinks lasted longer. They tasted better. They stayed fresh even after weeks at sea. To brew ale, you must boil the water. They didn't know why boiled water didn't rot, only that it didn't. Every wooden barrel of Viking beer was, in effect, a container of pasteurized hydration, created centuries before Pasteur himself was born. Their sour milk and whey carried another hidden advantage. The lactic acid dropped the pH low enough to stop dangerous bacteria in their tracks, while still delivering calories, minerals, and vitamins. Even in the Arctic cold, even on the open ocean, these drinks remained safe, alive with healthy microbes rather than deadly ones. The Vikings weren't drinking to get drunk, they were drinking to survive. Meanwhile, centuries later, civilized navies would still load ships with barrels of fresh water that rotted into lethal sludge. Men died by the thousands because no one thought to do what the Vikings had already mastered by intuition. It is one of history's strangest truths, doing the right thing for the wrong reason. The Vikings valued taste, longevity, and tradition, but the biological outcome was far more powerful than they ever realized. Their hydration system gave them something priceless at sea: operational dominance. By choosing fermentation over purity, they avoided the #1 killer of the age of sail without ever knowing the science behind it. And in the end, that quiet, humble barrel may have been just as important to Viking success as their iron swords or their elegant longships. Part 6. The Lessons of the Longship. Conclusion. So after everything we've explored, after the storms, the salt, the leaking hull, the combs, the barrels, and the beaches, we arrive at the central question. How did the Vikings manage waste on their longships without getting sick? The answer is both surprisingly simple and deeply profound. They didn't trap waste inside containers. They let the ocean dilute it before it ever had a chance to grow dangerous. They didn't lock themselves into the longship for months. They beached the vessel constantly, stepped onto open soil, reset the system, and allowed nature to take back what it could process safely. And they didn't rely on complicated technology. They relied on culture, on grooming, on discipline, on fermented drinks that unknowingly killed pathogens long before anyone understood why. The Vikings did not achieve perfect health. Archaeological records still show intestinal worms, dental infections, and the scars of a harsh life. But what they achieved was something even more valuable: operational sustainability. Their crews stayed functional. Their voyages succeeded. Their ships returned home. Contrast that with the British Royal Navy of 1854, a fleet equipped with modern toilets, surgeons, and infrastructure. On one such ship, cholera killed 43 men in just 2 weeks. Because sometimes adding systems doesn't eliminate the problem, it only gives disease a place to hide. And that brings us to the final truth the Vikings understood, intuitively, instinctively, and with absolute clarity. The best waste management system is the one that never allows waste to build up at all. In our modern lives, we often search for bigger storage, smarter technology, more advanced tools to handle the messes we create. But what if the Viking way offers a better lesson? What if the solution isn't to contain more, but to simplify more, to reset more, to release more? What if we allowed ourselves to beach our minds from time to time, step back onto figurative shorelines, and let the pressure of daily life drain away before it becomes poisonous? What if discipline, whether in hygiene, habits, or mindset, isn't a chore, but a survival tool? Viking engineering was never about conquering nature. It was about understanding it, working with it, designing life around the realities of the sea instead of fighting them. And so, as the Longship fades into the morning mist, its crew rowing in perfect rhythm, remember this: 65 men crossed the brutal North Atlantic without a toilet. They survived not because they had more, but because they carried less, reset often, and lived with clarity that we've somehow lost. The next time you feel overwhelmed by the waste of modern life, clutter, stress, noise, obligations, think of those men on the open deck, facing the cold wind with nothing but discipline, simplicity, and a system that never let anything rot. Thank you for watching Historia Prime. If you gained something today that you can carry into your own Longship, your home, your mind, your life, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us for more deep dives into the survival secrets of the ancient world. Skål.